Right, now that we've covered for loops, while loops, variables and arrays, we're going to see how we can build a little bit of interaction between the user and the server. There's two main ways of doing that: get variables and post variables. And we're going to start in this video looking at get variables, and there'll be a fairly chunky challenge at the end as well. So you may have seen get variables before. Essentially, they're encoded in the URL itself. So for example, if I wanted to put a get variable of name, I'd do it like this. So you may have seen things like this on websites before. It's a question mark, and then you have the name of the variable, which in this case is name, equals, and then the value of the variable. And if you want to have two variables, you separate them with and. So let's say my password is equal to 1234 for some horrendous reason. And we might have a third one of gender is male or something like that. So that's how you put get variables into the URL string. Now, if I load the page like that, you can see for the moment it loads exactly the same. So these get variables are passed to the PHP script, but obviously if you're not doing anything with them, it doesn't affect the website at all. So how do we access these get variables then within our script? It's actually really easy. They are all contained in an array called $_get. That's it. So if we wanted to display the contents of that array, we'd use print_r for human readable, and then the get array. So now let's have a look. There we go. So you can see we've got the name is Rob, password 1234, and gender is male. And of course, if you want to get any of those particular variables, then you would just find it in the normal way. So you access the get array and then choose which one you want. So gender, for example, that will display that particular value. All right, so we know now how to access some variables from our browser in our server script, but how do we get them there in the first place? Well, one way would be to have a link which contained those values in them, but a more common way is to use a form. And this is now the first time that we're going to be using a form with server-side processing, which is pretty cool. So let's create a little form. We'll have a very simple question: what's your name? And then we'll create our form in the usual way. Notice I'm doing all my HTML outside of my PHP script there, so it's not going to break my PHP. And then we'll have an input with a name of name and a type of text. And then we'll have our submit button. So input with a type of submit and a value equals, let's have a go. And that's it. So now I'll get rid of gender. Let's see what happens. So first off, I'm going to get rid of all of these get variables because we don't need them anymore. And then when we load that, we'll see the form. There it is. Notice we've got an empty array because there are no get variables at the top there. But if I now put Rob into the form and click go, you can see that that is put immediately at the top there. So if we wanted to say hello to whoever the user is, we might do something like, hi there. And then we access the get array and then name, and then pop a exclamation mark on the end there. Let's get rid of the print to avoid any confusion. And then let's pretend I'm someone else. I'm Kirsten. We get hi there, Kirsten. Excellent. So this is some genuine interaction that we're getting now between the user and the server script. So we're going to use that in a fairly big challenge, which will also use some loops and if statements. and we're going to make a very simple page called Is It Prime? Now, if you've done one of my app development courses, you will have done this before, so it should be pretty straightforward, but you won't have done it in PHP before. So first off, a prime number, if you don't remember from school, is a number that has no factors other than 1 and itself. So for example, 5 is prime because no number goes into it other than 1 and 5. 6 is not prime because 2 and 3 go into it. So what we want to do is we want the user to be able to enter any number into the box and for the PHP to process that number and tell us whether or not it is prime. Simple as that. You might need to do a little bit of paper and pen preparation for this one just to think through the problem because it's a little bit more subtle than we're used to. And you'll also need to find a way of working out whether a number goes into another number or not. And I'm sure you'll be able to do that with a quick Google. So, best of luck. Off you go. All right. Hope you managed it. Let's give it a shot. So, let's change our paragraph to say, please enter a whole number. And then we'll change the name of our input to number, and then we'll leave the submit as it is. And just to check that everything's connected up right, let's display the get array. There we go. So at the moment its name is Kirsten because that's what was there before. But if I put in 5, we should get number is 5. Excellent. So now the tricky bit. Let's have an if statement at the start, which checks to see if we've got an array there at all. And there's a nice easy way to do that. We can just look at the value of $_get, and if it has any contents, then it will run this. If not, then it won't. And what we need then is a loop which goes from 2 up to our number to test whether or not each of those numbers goes into our number. And if we don't get any, then it must be prime. If we do get some, then it's not prime. So I'm going to use a while loop because I generally prefer while loops. You could do it just as well with a for loop. So let's start with I is equal to 2. Notice I don't start at 1 because 1 goes into every number. So that would be silly. So I'm starting with 2. And then let's set up our loop. So we'll keep going as long as I is less than our number, which we get from our get array, like that. Remember, we don't want to keep going until it actually equals our number, because if I equals the number, it will definitely divide into it, because 3 divides into 3, or 5 divides into 5. So that doesn't count. We need to go up to, but not including our number. There we go. And then don't forget the increment command. All right. Now at this point, we need to check whether I divides into our number or not. And that's the thing that we don't know how to do. So let's do a Google. Start with PHP and then check if number divides another number. Something like that. Checking if a number is divisible by 6. That's quite specific, but it should give us the answer that we need. And there we go. Aha, so there's a thing called the modulus operator, which gives the remainder of the division. So if we use number %6, then if it goes exactly, it will equal 0. If it doesn't, then it won't. So that's perfect. Okay, so let's use that. If our number %i is equal to 0, so remember that means if the remainder when our number is divided by I is equal to 0, so if that is true, then that means that the number is not prime. And notice the double slash there. It's exactly the same as JavaScript. That's our way of leaving a comment in our code. So it's not prime because the remainder, when we divide it by I, is 0. So it must go exactly. Now we don't need an else there, because just because it doesn't divide it doesn't mean that it is prime necessarily. It has to be not divided by all the numbers for it to be prime. So the way I'm going to deal with that is I'm going to have a variable called isPrime, and initially we'll set that to true, and then if we get a number that divides into it, then we'll set isPrime to false. There we go. So I hope that makes sense. Feel free to go back and listen to that explanation again if you weren't entirely clear, because it's quite subtle. But essentially, we're going from 2 all the way up to 1 less than our number, and we're checking whether each of those numbers divides into our number, and if they do, then we're setting isPrime to false. All right, so once we've done that, isPrime will either be true or false. So we can check to see if isPrime, and we could do that, check whether it's equal to true, but it's slightly more elegant to just look at isPrime. Because isPrime is a Boolean, it's either true or false itself anyway, so we don't need to check whether it's equal to true explicitly. Then we'll say, put a paragraph tag, and I is a prime number. And if it's not, we'll say it's not prime. Prime numbers, by the way, are very important in computing, and particularly in the web and in payment systems. And believe it or not, our whole payment system is built on the fact that finding big prime numbers is hard. So if you found a solution that predicts prime numbers, you would be very rich indeed, and you would be able to break all online security. Fortunately, no one's done that yet. Okay, so let's have a look. I'm going to put in 6. Let's see what it says. 6 is not prime. That's promising. 9. 9 is not prime. Excellent. What about 7? 7 is a prime number. Hurrah! So it looks like it's working correctly. Brilliant. Now, what if I'm a bit cheeky and I put in 1 like that? Aha, interesting. So we've got a bit of a bug there. If we don't put in a nice positive integer, then we get this strange effect that 2 is a prime number. So why is it doing that? Well, remember, we're initially setting I equal to 2, and then we're keeping going as long as I is less than the number. But if we check that I is less than, and then a string ONE, then that's never going to be true. So it doesn't do this at all, and it just avoids this loop completely, and I is 2 down here, and isPrime is true. So we end up with 2 is a prime number, which may be true, but it's not quite what the user was asking. So let's do a check to see first off that the user enters a number. And that's something that we don't know how to do. So let's check PHP, check if string is numeric. Here we go. Find out whether a number or a variable is a number or numeric. And for once, we're not on Stack Overflow, actually, although this site's fairly slow to load, so I might see if Stack Overflow is faster. This is php.net, which is a really handy site. We'll come back to it, and it shows you the kind of official definitions of each function within PHP. But it's a little bit slower than Stack Overflow today. So we've got ctype underscore digit. It's a little bit of a vague answer, that one. This one looks closer to what we want. So if is underscore numeric value, and we're actually checking to see whether it's positive, and we're even on this answer checking to see if it's a whole number. And we're doing that by checking whether the value is equal to the value when it's rounded to 0 decimal places. So actually, that's a lot more than I wanted to check. But it will certainly suffice for us. So let's pop that in there. So we want to replace value with get number. So we're checking first off if number is numeric. Then we're checking that number is positive. And then we're checking if the number is a whole number. Okay. So those should be more or less all the checks that we need. Just back to php.net now that it's loaded. This is a really handy site. I particularly like the examples here. They make it really clear how each function works. Okay, so back to us. If we now save that and do our search for 1 again. Okay, so it's done the check and it hasn't returned anything. So that's good. We've not got a mistake here, although I realize I've misspelled number there. But it will be good to give an error message. So as a final little addition or tweak to make our code a little bit nicer, I'm going to add an else. And within my else, I'm going to check to see if they've submitted anything. So if we get to here, that means user has submitted something which is not a positive whole number. So at this point, we should say, please enter a positive whole number. And that's just a bit more elegant than not giving a message at all, except I've forgotten to do something. Yep. Semicolon. There we go. So now we've got a nice error. Please enter a positive whole number. And if we did that with 76.234 as well, we should get the same message. But if we go back to a whole number, it will tell us whether it's prime or not. Brilliant. So that was a fairly tricky programming challenge. As always, I hope you managed to do at least part of it yourself. And now we're experts with one way to communicate between the user and the server, that is get variables. We're then going to look in the next video at post variables, which is actually a more powerful way to communicate between the user and a server.